Our next speaker is Dr. Virginia Barbour, co-lead Office for Scholarly Communication, Queensland University of Technology, and Director of Open Access Australasia. Ginny was one of the 3 founding editors of PLOS Medicine and an editorial advisor to medRxiv. She has been involved in many international open access, innovative scholarly communication and publication, and research integrity initiatives. Ginny will deliver her presentation virtually, and the title of her talk is The Acceleration of Open Science Initiatives in 2022, an Australasian view of what's needed next.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will just share my screen. I'm just wondering if you could possibly mute at your end because I'm hearing myself twice. Apologies. I hope that you'll see my screen now. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction and the chance to talk to you. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be with you. I'm in sunny Brisbane. You can see the beautiful Mount Coot-tha behind me and Moreton Bay. I'm going to talk about my view of access and open initiative from Australasia. And I'm going to look at 2022, but I will also take a slight view backwards to see how we got to where we are. Apologies if I am still getting something of an echo, so if I'm sounding like hesitant, that's simply what I'm doing. So first off, I would just like to talk a little bit about the group that I represent. So I work for a group called Open Access Australasia, which is a very diverse audience, a very diverse group of universities and institutions and organisations from across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have all the new universities from New Zealand and more than half of the Australian ones. But we also, very interestingly, have a group of affiliate organisations that include Creative Commons Australia, but also perhaps some organisations you might not think of in the open access space, such as the Australian Science Association, which has a great interest in open science and actually has become increasingly important with some initiatives recently. In 2021, we spent some time looking at our principles, and the ones that we've articulated here are the ones that we use to drive our work. In particular, I'll highlight the top 2, the ones around equity and scholarly communication, and also a diverse ecosystem of open access approaches. And I will come on to that as we go through the talk. Also, just to note of importance for our region is the appropriate and respectful use of Indigenous knowledges, and that is something that is also included in any of the work that we do. So I'm dividing my talk into these 3 areas. I'm going to talk a bit about COVID-19 and other research drivers. I'm going to talk about some Australasian perspectives specifically. And then I'll talk about what I think are a couple of really key challenges to consider. So I think it's fair to say that the last 3 years have been pretty momentous in open science. We've seen some really dramatic changes, and some of these are related to COVID, but some of them were in place and in process well before. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with Plan S from Coalition S, which in early 2018 came together to devise a plan for making the research that they fund immediately open through a diversity of routes, not just through journals, but through repositories, but crucially through requiring immediate open access through the use of a CC BY license. So that means that the research can be used and reused maximally. 2021 was a very important year for Coalition S because the policies came into place at the beginning of that year, and now all research that is funded by these funders has to be made immediately open. The second one I'll talk about is UNESCO Open Science Recommendation. So this was also being thought of before the pandemic. It became important in started off in 2018. But throughout the work continued throughout the pandemic, and through a mix of in-person and virtual meetings, there was an extensive consultation around the development. And I know that this is something that has been looked at, is being considered in the course of this conference. I would just say that probably the most important thing that came out of it was a definition of open science, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it has really set the scene for how we think about science in a global way. I was involved in the final expert meeting when the wording was finally agreed, but as again many of you will know, it was adopted at the final General Assembly of 2021 in November, and is now there is now excellent work going on towards its implementation. I'm in the middle of this slide. I've got I'd like to just talk about the effect that COVID has had on open science, which again many of you will be really familiar with. But I think there's just some notable parts to talk about. The first one, this CORD-19 open research data set, is an enormous data set, more than 1 million machine-readable publications on COVID-19. It came about as a call from the then Trump White House in association with international collaboration with a number of governments globally, and was really important, not just because of its size, but also because for the large part, most of its research was openly licensed, and that has led to a permanent open database. There are challenges with it in that not all the research is open, but largely it has been an incredibly important resource. The other thing that happened as a result of COVID-19 was that it definitely became much clearer to many governments and intergovernmental organisations there was a need for a concerted approach to open science. So APEC came out with a statement on open science in 2021, as did the G7 as part of their research compact. And these I think are really important signals that open science, that open research, open access is absolutely on the agenda of governments and intergovernmental agencies globally. On the right-hand side of this slide is just I'd like to talk about two initiatives that have happened from the US White House. These are from President Biden's White House. So there have been repeated calls for public access to various types of open research in relation to specific diseases. And the one that is up here on the top right is just the most recent one, and that's in relation to monkeypox that came out at the beginning of August of this year. Probably most importantly, though, was the one below it, which is a guidance which was issued by the OSTP in August 2022, which calls for that all federally funded research will have to be made immediately open, with policies and processes to be in place by the beginning of 2026. So this supersedes the kind of calls for public access that we've seen in the past. So monkeypox, and before that Ebola, and before that COVID. We're now at the point where the US federal the White House, which is of course the executive body of government in the US, is going to require immediate open access to research. So that's a really big game changer when we think about open science generally. And I think that we're going to be looking very closely at what those federal agencies come up with. Just to kind of look a little bit more about the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation. And again, apologies if you're very familiar with this, but I'm particularly interested in it because I think one of the most important things it did was to develop a definition of open science in a way that we haven't really thought about in a very inclusive way before. In addition to the open science knowledge that we have at the top here, the publications, the research data, we also have these really other important aspects of open science that perhaps have not been thought about so carefully before. So on the right-hand side, the open science infrastructure, the open engagement with societal actors, again, from our perspective in Australia and New Zealand, engagement with Indigenous knowledges is really important. And on the left-hand side, the open dialogue with other knowledge systems such as citizen science. And that's one of the reasons that my group is very excited to be working with the Australian Citizen Science Association, because it is a group that does a lot of open science, but has traditionally been somewhat marginalised when it comes to these international initiatives. So what happened in Australia and New Zealand during the pandemic, and I think the reason I'm just highlighting some of these, and apologies for all the things that are on it, is because I think it's a theme that we're seeing increasingly, is the cooperation that's happening across different bodies as we respond to, in this case, the pandemic, and as we hope going forward in response to, for example, the climate emergency. There was a lot of intersectoral collaboration and communication. So, for example, in Australia, the COVID-19 expert database was done across all the learned academies. There were resources developed by the Rapid Research Information Forum, which came from the Australian government's chief scientist, but which was again fed into by a number of different agencies. The same was true in New Zealand. The bottom left, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment coordinated that research. We had our large national health funder, the NHMRC, developed a huge body of information on medical responses to COVID-19. And the other thing that was really interesting, just in the centre of this slide, the impact of COVID-19 on women in the STEM workforce was just an example of the very thoughtful work that went into long-term consideration of what COVID meant for across science and society more generally. So that was, I think, a really high point in what we saw in relation to the collaboration in open science. And in fact, one of the things that's quite funny to reflect on is that you may well be familiar with these cartoons that came out in the early part of the pandemic. Some of the best science communication came from New Zealand. It was a collaboration between Susie Wiles and a cartoonist, and their work, partly because, I mean, it undoubtedly was of very high quality, but really key to it was published openly with open licenses, and so it was enormously influential globally in influencing science communication. And I think it's a really nice example of how open science and open science communication can be really important when it's managed well and really shared appropriately. So what's happening in Australasia at the moment? So this is a very busy slide, obviously. I'm not going to walk through it all. It's available on our Open Access Australasia website. It's one of two that I'll show you. This is for Australia, and I have one for New Zealand as well. What it really shows is that we've spent 20 years getting to a point where open science, open access is completely on the highest policy agendas. It started right back in the early 2000s. On the left here, we have when the Australian National University developed its own repository. QUT, where I currently sit, was the world's first university to have an open access policy for its research outputs, right through to work done in the mid-2013, 2012, when the two big funders came up with open access policies. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's increasing refinement of policies and the Australian chief scientist work on open access, which I will come to in a moment. What this really does show, I think in particular, is the cross-sectoral engagement in open access. So you can see on the left here, we have the advocacy bodies in yellow, government in green, funders in purple, institutions in blue. All of these are participants in the open research ecosystem. The same is true for Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is obviously a much smaller country. There's only 8 universities there. But again, the breadth of the work that was done in relation to open science is really enormous, starting back in 2000, open source library systems. And for example, in 2016, up here in blue, there's a really important initiative developed by Auckland University of Technology in their open publishing press. So we're seeing a diversity of approaches from across the sector. And a little piece of work that we did during the pandemic to try and make the case to government was to talk about some case studies that really illustrated the need for a concerted approach to open access. The first one is this top left is around policy advisors. Even in the time of the pandemic, we knew that policy advisors at the highest level of government, and this is an illustration of Canberra, the parliamentary building. We were told by advisors that they could not access the research they needed. They did not have the resources available to large universities, and they were struggling at times with access to see the research they needed. So that's one example of how lack of access to publications is a real problem. The case study at the bottom is around lack of access to data and a lack of coordination to data. And this was another real life example that happened Actually, just before the pandemic in Australia, we had a terrible summer of bushfires. And what we found was there was a complete lack of coordination and integration of mapping of bushfires when people needed real-time access to data on where the bushfires were. It was left to actually, in this case, an individual researcher sitting in a small university in New South Wales who pulled this together with some difficulty. And what we found was that the data collection, for example, stopped at the state border. So if you're familiar with Australia, you know that we have states that all up the east coast. This is New South Wales, but he could not, for example, collect data easily from Queensland, which is the state above it. So there was a real problem with integration. But I'm pleased to say that there is a good piece of work going on now in Australia and New Zealand that suggests that we are beginning to see work go in a more collaborative way and a more concerted effort to move towards an open approach. Dr. Cathy Foley, who was appointed as Australia's Chief Scientist at the beginning of 2021, has named open access as one of the key pillars of her strategic work plan and is working on a national approach at the moment. In the middle of 2022, our National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC, announced its new open access policy, which is in alignment with the Coalition S. In fact, they have joined Coalition S, and they will require immediate open access to publications for all grants funded from now on and in the future for 2024 for grants currently in place. So that's a very substantial change for the policy development. And in New Zealand, the Chief Science Advisor there released a paper called "The Future is Open" in the middle of this year, which also indicates that there is an absolute need for, and to some extent also a willingness for an open approach to research in New Zealand. And we are looking forward to seeing how that develops over the next few months. The group Open Access Australasia, we've put forward a proposal about how we might think about investment in the open scholarly communication system. We are very keen to see a diversity of approaches, and I'll come back to that in a little while. We see the need for investment over several years. There is a clear need to support immediate approaches right now, such as read and publish deals that are being negotiated by universities. But there's also a need to support foundational infrastructure for open science. So, for example, the type of the work that is being coordinated by SCOSS, which is the sponsoring consortium for open scholarly infrastructure, is trying to ensure that we invest in, for example, infrastructure such as the Directory of Open Access Journals and related initiatives that are used globally by everybody, which are really not supported on a concerted level. However, we would also like to see investment in university and subject repositories. In Australia, for example, the last tranche of investment was back in the early, before 2010, essentially. But a really key part of what we see as an important initiative is to invest in the future of open scholarly communication. So supporting innovation, the types of things that we often see coming that are academic-led, and supporting Australia. This is a vision for Australia in particular, specific publishing and journals. Again, the types of journals, for example, that are support Indigenous research are often not of great interest to large publishers. So there's an absolute need for those to be supported at a local level. But we know that takes time, and this is just a quick timeline of a piece of work that Open Access Australasia did with the Council of Australian University Librarians when we made the case throughout the pandemic for a need for a concerted approach. We attempted to have an in-person meeting right at the beginning of the pandemic. That obviously didn't go anywhere, but we managed to use the ability to meet online to quite effectively lobby and advocate for a national approach. Part of that is the work that the Chief Scientist is now taking up, but we're now also taking forward a piece of work to try and collaborate on open science globally. Open science across Australia. And there'll be some more information on that coming out in the next few months. So what are the next key challenges? So there's just two I'd really like to point out. Just going back to the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, I think one thing that was also really important, as well as the definition of open science, was the core values and guiding principles that were part of the Open Science Recommendation. And the two that I'll pull out just to talk about briefly are the ones at the bottom relating to equity and fairness and diversity and inclusiveness. And that very much talks to the principles that we are very keen about at Open Access Australasia. So just talking about the equity side of things, I will just say this was brought very much home to me last week during Open Access Week. So as many of you will know, Open Access Week is the opportunity to talk about open access from many different perspectives, and the theme this year was Open for Climate Justice. We ran a series of webinars throughout the week, which are all now available on our website. The theme very much in our region, in particular for collaborators in the Pacific, is the need for equity and inclusion of them within any open research ecosystem. And we had a very powerful panel about climate and justice in the Pacific, and Dr. Dalai Gabaru spoke at some length about the fact that much of the work that is done within open science at the moment simply does not include the communities that are most affected by it. We often think about open science or open access right at the end of the research process. The case that they were making was that we need to be thinking about sharing knowledge right from the very beginning through co-designing research, involving communities all the way through the process, and right up through to transparency and sharing research at the end. And that critically needs to include sharing research in the appropriate languages. And I would really urge you to have a listen to the webinars. They were really informative, and particularly the perspectives from the Pacific made me think very profoundly about how we need to be thinking about making sure that open science as it goes forward is properly inclusive. And then the other perspective that I think that we really need to be building into everything that we do is the diversity in the scholarly communications ecosystem. So this is a paper that was published by the Confederation of Open Access Repositories back in 2020, and it's just getting more and more relevant. It's incredibly important that as we move to a more open ecosystem, particularly one that is where we have an increasing number of read and publish deals, we don't have a model that is dominated simply by big publishers. We have to nurture publications from a multitude of publishers, but we also have to nurture a multitude of different routes. And I think the role of repositories, the role of experimental journals, and the role of perhaps even areas that we haven't really thought about in sharing research is going to become increasingly important. And that's a piece of work that CORE is continuing to work on. So I'll finish just with a couple of thoughts. So I think it's pretty clear over the last few years, but it's become very obvious that open science is the way to go, and we need to be moving towards that. There are absolutely some challenges, and I think the two ones I'd just point out at the top are that I think, unfortunately, the direction and rate of change is often is not being directed in a concerted way, and I think that that means that we, to some extent, what happens is directed by external forces. That may be something like the pandemic, or it may also be, for example, if large publishers are deciding on a particular approach, that may also be pointing to the end up sort of directing us in a particular way. I think there is a real problem about the infrastructure for open science, and this is something that the UNESCO recommendation talks about extensively. So I'd like to see the future to be principle-led. I'd like to make sure that equity and diversity is at the forefront of that, and I think that has to be built into everything that we do. And what is really, really clear, I think, is that we need a system-wide shift, but that is going to require global collaboration. That's a core principle of the work that we're trying to do at the moment. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So I've got the first question. Shall I just read them out? Is that the easiest thing to do, or do you?
Yeah, that should be fine. Thank you.
Great. Yes. So how do I think the world's view of open science initiatives can mimic Australia's initiatives? Well, I think that some of the work that we're doing is at the forefront, but some of it, I would say, we are somewhat lagging behind. I've given you a snapshot of some of the things the highlights that I think are happening. We don't yet have a concerted approach yet to open science. I would like to see a national approach to that, and that is something that we're working on. But I do think one of the things that came across when we did a piece of work to try and the timeline that I showed you, what became really clear is the need to have a high level national champion if you want to take forward open science, or even open access in our cases for the chief scientist. It's really important to get a buy-in at the highest level of your funder, your government, and agreement to lead it. I think that's the key lesson that I would say that we took away.
Thank you very much.